What happens after death? The question everyone avoids. There's one question that never really leaves you. You can ignore it. You can distract yourself. You can push it to the back of your mind. But it's always there. What happens after death? Not in a philosophical way, not in a religious way, but in the simplest, most direct sense. When everything stops, what actually happens? You've probably thought about it before. Maybe late at night, when everything is quiet, or in a moment where life suddenly feels fragile. The idea appears, and for a second, it feels impossible to understand. Because death is something you know will happen, but something you can never experience in advance. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Every experience you've ever had, every thought, every memory, every feeling has happened inside your mind. Your entire sense of reality depends on your brain being active. So when the brain stops, what's left? It's easy to assume there must be something more. Some continuation, some form of awareness that carries on. Because the idea of everything simply ending feels too abrupt. But science approaches this question differently. It doesn't start with beliefs. It starts with observation from a biological perspective. Everything that you experience, your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of self is tied to physical processes inside your brain. Electrical signals, chemical reactions, pattern. Your identity is not separate from your brain. It is your brain. And that leads to a very direct, very uncomfortable idea. If those processes stop completely, then the experience they produce may stop as well. Not slowly, not partially, but entirely. Think about what happens when you fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. There are moments where there is no awareness, no memory. You don't experience that gap, you simply skip over it. Now imagine that state. Without waking up, no thoughts, no perception, no sense of self, not darkness, not silence. Because even those require awareness to exist, just nothing. And that's difficult to grasp. Because your mind is designed to imagine experiences, it tries to turn everything into something. But in this case, there is nothing to picture. No observer, no experience, no continuation in the way you understand it. And that's where the question becomes even deeper. Because if your entire experience of reality depends on your brain, then what you call you may not exist independently at all. It may be something that only exists while the system is running, which means death. It might be the end of the experience of anything. But before jumping to conclusions, there's something important to understand. Because what happens at the moment of death, and what science actually says about it, is more complex than it first appears. And once you look closer, the answer becomes even more surprising than you expect. So what really happens at the moment of death? Not the idea of it, not the fear of it, but the actual physical process. From a scientific perspective, death is not a single instant. It's a sequence, a gradual shutdown of systems that were once working together perfectly. It begins when the body can no longer maintain its essential functions. The heart stops beating. Oxygen, which every cell depends on, stops reaching the brain. And that's where things change very quickly. Your brain is extremely sensitive. It needs a constant supply of oxygen and energy to keep functioning. Without it, the system starts to break down within seconds. Electrical activity begins to fade. Communication between neurons weakens. The patterns that create your thoughts, your awareness, your sense of self start to collapse. At first, this process may not feel like nothing. In fact, some evidence suggests the opposite. In the early moments after clinical death, the brain can show a sudden surge of activity. A brief, intense burst, almost, like the system trying to stabilize or process what's happening. Some researchers believe this could be connected to near-death experiences. Moments where people report vivid sensations, bright lights, strong emotions, a feeling of detachment from the body. But even these experiences, if they occur, are still part of the brain's activity. They are not happening after death. They are happening during the final moments, while the brain is still functioning. Because once the brain fully shuts down, those experiences stop completely. And this is the key point. Everything you've ever known, every thought, every memory, every feeling depends on those patterns of activity continuing. When the activity ends, the experience ends with it. Not gradually, not in a way you can observe, but in the same way a process stops when the system powering it shuts off. Think about turning off a device. The screen doesn't slowly drift into another world. It doesn't continue somewhere else. The display simply disappears because the process creating it has ended. Your consciousness may work in a similar way, not as something separate from the brain, but as something produced by it, which means when the production stops, there is nothing left to experience. But here's where it becomes difficult to understand. Because you've never experienced. Even in deep sleep, even when you're unconscious, your brain is still active at some level. There is always a return, a continuation, a point where awareness comes back. Death removes that completely. No return, no next moment, no awareness of nothing, emptiness. But those are still experiences. They require a mind to perceive them. Without that mind, there is no experience at all. And this leads to an important shift, because the question, what happens after death, might not have the kind of answer you expect. It's not about what you will experience. It's about whether there is any experience left to have. And if everything depends on the brain, then the answer may not be about continuation at all, but about the complete end of the process that creates your sense of reality. And once you begin to understand that, a deeper question starts to form. If consciousness depends entirely on the brain, then what exactly is consciousness in the first place? So if everything you experience depends on your brain, then what exactly is consciousness? It feels like something separate, something personal. The you behind your thoughts, your awareness, your sense of being alive. It feels like it should exist on its own, independent of the body. But science doesn't see it that way. From a scientific perspective, it's a process, a result of billions of neurons interacting with each other, constantly exchanging signals, forming patterns of activity that create your experience of reality, your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of identity. All of it emerges from this complex system. It's not located in one place. It's not a single structure. It's an ongoing activity, and that changes how you should think about it. Because if consciousness is something your brain produces, then it doesn't exist independently from that production. It depends on it completely. Think about a flame. A flame looks like a stable object. It has a shape, a color, a presence. But in reality, it's not a thing. A continuous reaction happening over time. The moment the reaction stops, the flame disappears. It doesn't go somewhere else. It doesn't continue in another form. It simply ends. Consciousness may work in a similar way. It feels stable, continuous, like a solid self that exists over time. But underneath that feeling, it's constantly being recreated by the activity in your brain, moment by moment, pattern by pattern. And that's why it feels like you are always there. because the process is continuous, but not permanent. Now consider what happens when that process is interrupted. Even small changes in the brain can dramatically affect consciousness. A slight imbalance in chemicals can change how you feel, how you think, how you perceive reality. Damage to certain areas can alter memory, personality, even the sense of self. This shows something important. Your consciousness is not separate from your brain. It is dependent on it. Every part of your experience is tied to physical processes. When those processes change, your experience changes. So when the brain stops completely, the process that creates consciousness has nothing to continue it. No activity, no pattern, no experience. And this leads to a difficult but logical conclusion. Consciousness does not leave the body, because it is not a separate entity to begin with. It is something that happens. And when the conditions for it are gone, it stops happening. This doesn't mean consciousness is unimportant. In fact, it makes it more remarkable. Because everything you've ever known, every moment of awareness, every thought, every emotion is the result of this incredibly complex process. A process that feels like a stable self, even though it's constantly changing. And once you see that, the idea of what happens after death starts to look very different. Because the question is no longer about where consciousness goes. It's about whether it can exist at all without the system that creates it. And if it can't, then the answer to what happens next may not be about continuation. It may be about the end of the process itself. But even this isn't the full picture, because there's still one more layer to understand. Not just about what ends, but about what it actually means for something to stop completely. So if consciousness is a process, and that process stops at death, then a strange question appears. What does it actually feel like to be gone? Your mind immediately tries to answer that. It imagines darkness, silence, emptiness, a kind of endless void where nothing happens. But there's a problem with that idea. All of those are still experiences. Darkness is something you hear. Emptiness is something you feel. And all of those require awareness. Without awareness, none of those things exist. So when you try to imagine nothing, you're not actually imagining nothing. You're imagining something very minimal, but still something. And that's the limitation. Your mind cannot truly see the absence of experience, because every thought you have is already an experience. So it replaces nothing with the closest thing it can understand. But the reality may be very different. It may not feel like anything at all. Not even emptiness. Not even silence. Because feeling itself requires a mind to process it. Think about a moment when you were completely unconscious. No dreams, no awareness, no memory. When you wake up, it doesn't feel like you experienced a long period of nothing. It feels like a gap, a missing piece. Something you didn't experience at all. Now imagine that gap. Without an end, not a long time. Because time requires awareness too. This is where the idea becomes difficult, because your entire understanding of reality is built on experience. You define existence through what you can perceive, think, or feel. So the idea of something beyond experience feels impossible. But that may be exactly what death is. Not a transition into another state you can feel, but the complete absence of any state at all. Not from what death is, but from trying to imagine it as something. Your mind keeps searching for a way to understand it, to picture it, to give it a form, but it can't. Because there is no perspective left to experience anything, and that leads to an unexpected shift. If there is no awareness after death, then there is no suffering, no fear, no sense of loss, because all of those require. From the inside, there is no after, no continuation of experience, no awareness of absence, and that changes the way you should think about it. Death is not something you experience. It's the end of the ability to experience. And that's a very different idea. Because it means there is no moment where you are. They're realizing that everything is gone. And once you understand that, the question starts to shift again. Not just what happens after death, but what it really means to be alive right now. Because if experience itself can end completely, then the fact that it exists at all becomes something much more profound. And that leads to one final realization. Not about death, but about the value of the only thing you ever truly have, this moment of awareness. So if death is not an experience, if it is the complete end of awareness, the stopping of the process that creates everything you know, then something important becomes clear. Death is not something you will ever feel, because when it happens, there is no you left to feel anything at all. And that realization changes the way you should think about life. Because right now, this moment, your awareness exists. You can experience reality in a way that depends entirely on a delicate temporary process inside your brain. A process that will not last forever. And that doesn't make life meaningless. It makes it rare. Because out of everything that exists in the universe, this experience, your experience, is something incredibly specific. A brief window where the universe becomes aware of itself. Through not permanent, not guaranteed, but real, right now. And once you understand that, the focus shifts. Instead of asking what comes after death, you start to see what exists before it more clearly. This moment, this awareness, this ability to experience anything at all, because that's the only thing you ever truly have. The past exists only as memory. The future exists only as possibility. But your experience, your awareness, is always happening here. Now. And it is temporary, which gives it weight, meaning, not because it lasts forever, but because it doesn't. Think about it. If your awareness were endless, if every moment continued without limit, there would be no urgency, no significance to anything you do. But the fact that it can end, that it will end, makes every moment different. It makes it matter, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a simple, quiet way. Because every experience you have is part of a limited sequence, a finite pattern that will not repeat in exactly the same way. And once it's gone, there is no awareness left to wish for more time, no perspective left to regret, no mind left to hold onto anything, which means everything that matters only matters while you are here to experience it. And that's the final shift. The question, what happens after death, stops being the most important one, because the answer may simply be nothing you will ever experience. And instead, what are you doing with the experience you have right now? Because this moment, this awareness, is not something to wait for. It's already happening. And one day, without warning, without announcement, it will stop. Not into darkness, not into silence, but into the absence of experience itself. And until that moment comes, this, what you are experiencing right now,